Short stories are an excellent place to play with and learn about different aspects of writing. If you want to try a new perspective, point of view, form, or some other aspect of writing, a short story is a great place to experiment with it. This is something I did in my collection When Magic Calls, a collection of modern fairy tales. In there, I tried to use a different point of view or perspective for each story, and I also often tried to use a different form. These are things that I enjoy trying out. Again, short stories are a great place to do this because if it doesn't work out, you haven't spent an entire novel trying it. Short stories are also a great place to learn about different aspects of writing. By reading short stories, you'll get exposed to different authors' approaches to whatever technique you're studying faster, so you'll get more information faster. That's why today I want to talk about Pretty Monsters by Kelly Link, how to use atmosphere and abrupt endings. Pretty Monsters is both the name of the short story and of Link's collection. In the short story, Link actually has 3 stories in one. There are 3 different worlds and points of view, which means she has 3 different atmospheres and 3 different abrupt endings that she is dealing with. This is a great place to learn about those aspects of writing because in one short story, you're getting 3 different versions. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. Let's start with 1 story, 3 tales, and 3 atmospheres. Atmosphere is vital to the success of Pretty Monsters because in each of the 3 stories, Link has a very distinct atmosphere. What that means is a reader is going to know which story they're in, even if they mix up the names, because of the way the setting feels. Here's an example of atmosphere from the first story that features Clementine. The world was still dark. Windows were blue-black rectangles nailed upon black walls. Her parents' door was shut. The interrogative snores and snorts from their bedroom were the sounds of a beast snuffling about in a cave. Wet confetti ends of grass cut the day before stuck to the soles of her bare feet. Notice how Link uses 3 of the 5 senses to describe this setting. Readers know what the yard and house looks like, sounds like, and feels like. When you use more of the 5 senses, you develop more of an atmosphere. Also notice how she's building a mysterious yet positive atmosphere. It's mysterious because it's dark, it's early morning, people are still asleep, and Clementine is creeping around. It's slightly positive and not necessarily foreboding because the grass is described as confetti, which is a more positive word choice than something like bits of torn up paper might have been. Now compare this atmosphere to the atmosphere of another story in Pretty Monsters, Lee's story. Lee directs Bad down the dirt road into a meadow surrounded by mountains, a stream running through it. A 2-story farmhouse that Dodo has painted Pepto-Bismol pink. Only the barn looks the way a barn should, red and white with a weather vane, a nanny goat standing upon a wheel of cheese. Only when you get closer do you see that instead of painting the barn, Dodo has cut open and tacked up hundreds and hundreds of Coca-Cola cans to the wooden boards. This atmosphere is still a bit whimsical like the first one, but it's also more practical. And the more Lee's story goes on, the more that practicality comes out, which leads Lee's story to feel like reality, and Clementine's to feel more like a fantasy. That's one way that atmospheres can juxtapose each other and help signal your reader which story they are in. So if you're writing a story that has dual timelines, multiple points of view, or some other distinguishing sections, Making sure the atmospheres of those different pieces are distinct is going to be one way you can subconsciously signal your readers which part of your story they are in. One way to do this is to ask yourself, how does that setting feel to each of your point of view characters? It might be the same place, but it feels differently depending on who is there. Also ask yourself how that place feels in different eras. If you're using a dual timeline, again, you might have the same setting, but it could be vastly different depending on the time period. When you're using atmosphere in this way, pay particular attention to your word choice when you're describing your setting. Again, the confetti word that describes the grass in Clementine's story is the only word that makes the reader aware that this setting is not scary. It's just mysterious. In Lee's story, the Pepto-Bismol pink, that color adds to the whimsical feel. If the house had been a different color, that place might not have felt as whimsical. Now, when you're doing this, you don't need to be hyper aware of every descriptive word you're using. Just make sure in some places you're choosing words specifically to build your atmosphere and that carry some sort of emotion so that you can build that emotion that you're going for. Saying something is Pepto-Bismol pink is very different than saying something was a faded red, so faded it became pink. Those descriptions have different emotions attached to them, and so you can use them to build different atmospheres. So take advantage of your word choice to make the most impact on your readers. That's how Link is using atmosphere in Pretty Monsters. Next, I want to talk about abrupt endings that work. Pretty Monsters is not just 3 stories mixed together. It's a story within another story. The outer stories are aware of the inner ones, but not vice versa. And how these stories are truly connected does not become clear until the very end. All of these stories are tied together by a theme of girls, youth, and werewolves. These are the threads that pull each of these stories together, and the way Link approaches each of these themes is different in each story, so it gives you unique perspectives and ways of interacting with these concepts. And again, how this interaction is really happening doesn't become clear until the last few paragraphs. So I do want to warn you now that we are talking about endings. If you want to read Pretty Monsters, this is your spoiler alert. I'm going to talk about the endings of 2 of the stories in there, and I'm going to read those last few paragraphs. So if you don't want to see this part yet, jump ahead to the timestamp at the bottom of your screen. Let's jump right in. This is the ending to Clementine's story. You're going to see how it is very abrupt, and then I'm going to tell you why it works anyway. Here was Cable, bloodied and unconscious and alive. And here she was to rescue him. This time, she would rescue him. Whatever had happened, she was meant to be here. Cable's eyes opened. Clementine could have bent down and put her hand on his long, tangled hair. The bark on the tree above him was silver. It hung down in tattered flags. The woman beside him, Cable's wife, flung her arm out as if to catch something. It wasn't their blood after all. Clementine said to the boyfriend, "Did you ever have an idea of how your life was supposed to go, except that you were wrong about everything?" "Clementine," the boyfriend said. He'd put his camera down at last. "Clementine, I think we're in real trouble here." That is the ending of the Clementine piece of Pretty Monsters. It's abrupt. You don't know for sure what happens, but most readers do. Why this abrupt ending works and why the lack of a traditional resolution works is because Link is playing with a trope readers of this genre know well. They can assume that Clementine and the boyfriend are about to be eaten by the boy that Clementine has been obsessed with and his werewolf bride. Because readers can assume and imagine that's what happens, they are more willing to accept an untraditional, abrupt ending. So it's that trope that makes the ending work. Lee's story is a little different. Here is her abrupt ending and the way Link approached girls, youth, and werewolves in Lee's story. "Not a coyote," Dodo said, "a wolf. Between me and the barn now. There's another one here as well, trying to sneak up on me." "What should I do?" Lee says. Bad and Maureen yell something about coming out of the outhouse. "Everybody stay where they are," Dodo says loudly. The thing at the side of the barn is scratching and pawing and digging now. Lee can hear its excited breath. There's a loud report from outside. Dodo has pulled the trigger, and inside the barn all 4 Tennessee fainting goats fall over. If only Bad were there to see them. There is a snarling and growling, a bereaved, furious howling. Here we see a similarly deadly situation. This time there were not as many warning signs about the girls being werewolves as there were in Clementine's story, so it's a little bit more of a surprise here. However, we can still assume what happens after this ending. If Dodo was able to shoot and mortally wound one of the wolves, we can't assume she's able to do that to the other one, so the humans likely make it out of here unscathed. The werewolves probably do not. Again, this is an ending that's abrupt. It doesn't have a resolution. It's not really traditional, but it works because readers can still figure out what most likely happened. Because they are able to make that leap, this ending works. They don't feel as much like cliffhangers when readers can kind of fill in the blanks for themselves. Again, in Lee's ending, we do see girls making stubborn, youthful decisions that most adults would probably not make. Those decisions are what led up to this ending. This is the end of the spoiler alert. If you're coming back to us, I'm not going to be talking about specifics of the Pretty Monster endings anymore, just generally how to make abrupt endings work. Both the endings that I talked about and the third ending work because readers can assume and figure out what happens next. Readers are able to do this because Link did all of the work to develop a good story. The characters are believable, and they're people that readers can guess what their next decisions are going to be. The plot is clear. There's no confusing mystery left unsolved, and the climax is reached and on the page. Even though the ending is short and abrupt, we do still get that climactic moment. That is key to allowing readers to figure out what happens next. What's really missing here is maybe the tail end of that climax in a couple of the stories, but in particular, the resolution is what's not present. That's really what makes these endings feel abrupt. If you're not going to include a resolution, readers should be able to figure out what that resolution might be on their own. They're going to be able to do that because of the work you put into the earlier parts of the story. Because you led them up to this climax, it's believable, they accept it, and based on what happened, they can figure out what happens next. If you want to use an abrupt ending, you have to put in that work too. Again, Link's endings, all 3 of them, work because all 3 of them have to do with girls, youthful decisions, and werewolves. This ties the story together, and it makes the endings work even more because each time Link is showing these themes in a different way, which is part of the interest factor for the reader. Now that I've talked about the atmosphere and abrupt endings in Pretty Monsters, I want to share why an editor recommends Pretty Monsters by Kelly Link. Endings and atmosphere are 2 very important aspects of a story. If you don't have a good ending, your readers are probably not going to read your next story. If you don't have a clear atmosphere, it can be hard for a reader to feel like they've really sunk in to the world of your story. Both of these components are key to your reader's experience. So if you're struggling with an aspect of writing like this, reading short stories is one way you can study that aspect. Look at Pretty Monsters. From one short story, you can look at 3 different types of abrupt endings. You can also look at 3 different atmospheres. These are crafted by the same author. So if you need different perspectives, you might look at 3 different short stories and again, look at those same components. Reading is a great way to learn about writing. Then, when you're ready, try it out in your own short story. Again, short stories are a great way to experiment without having to commit to a full novel. You might find that you love what you're doing and you want to expand that short story into a longer story. That's perfectly fine too. But knowing that you're not committing to 80,000 words or more can take some of the pressure off of you when you're trying something new. One experiment I made in a short story was a circular form. In the Western world, most of our stories are linear, and I wanted to play with a different form that spiraled and circled around the point of the story, each time changing something about that story. So I decided to do it in a short piece instead of trying to do a whole novel that way for the very first time. That story is But the Fairy Tale Isn't Over in my collection, and because it made it into the collection, I think it was a successful experiment. I will say it's a polarizing one. My beta readers either loved it or hated it, but I'm okay with that because it makes the story memorable. After you have experimented with something, it's up to you to decide if it was successful and publishable, or if it's something that you tried and learned from, but won't make it out into a reader's hands. Through Pretty Monsters, you'll learn how to develop atmosphere and use abrupt endings. But you'll also get to see 3 different times this author had to develop characters and create plot and format the story and use all of the other writing techniques that go into writing a story. So Pretty Monsters is a great starting place if you're looking for something like that. What's a short story you read recently that stuck with you? And why? What technique did you learn? For more videos on atmosphere and endings and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. There you will also find a guide to building strong settings, which is a component of atmosphere. And now it's your turn to make sure your atmospheres and endings are clear and earned, like Kelly Links in Pretty Monsters, to ignite your ink.